Good evening and welcome to the first session of our winter term morning webinar series by the Institute of International Monetary Research in collaboration with the Vinson Center for the Public Understanding of Economics and Entrepreneurship at the University of Buckingham. I'm Dr. Juan Castañeda, Director of the IIMR, and today we'll be hosting Professor Mark Skousen. Mark is a professional economist, an investment expert, university professor, and author of over 25 books. He earned his doctorate in economics in 1977 from George Washington University. In 2004 and 5, he taught economics and finance at Columbia Business School and Columbia University. And he has also taught economics, finance, and business at other universities, Barnard, Mercy, and Rollins colleges. In 2014, he was appointed a presidential fellow at Chapman University in California. Since 1980, Skousen has been editor-in-chief of Forecasts and Strategies, an award-winning investment newsletter. He was an analyst for the CIA, a columnist for Forbes magazine, chairman of Investment U, and past president of the Foundation for Economic Education in New York. He's the editor of his own website and the producer of Freedom Fest, which meets every July in Las Vegas. His economics works include the structure of production, the big three in economics, economic logic, and econopower. His investment books include Investing in One Lesson and The Maxims of Wall Street. His latest book is Viennese Walls Down Wall Street, Austrian Economics for Investors. Based on his work at the structure of production, the federal government began publishing in spring 2014 a broader, more accurate measure of the economy, gross output, every quarter along the GDP. And this is going to be precisely the topic of today's presentation. Today, we'll be discussing the implications of using gross output for the making of monetary decisions, after which we'll allow time for Q&A with viewers at home. Today's presentation will be recorded and made available on the Institute's YouTube channel. Questions must be submitted via the Q&A option, and I will moderate them and address the speaker. So thank you very much, Mark, for accepting our invitation. We are delighted to have you on our series, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
So thank you very much, Juan. I assume everyone can hear me okay. I'm going to talk about gross output, GO, and its relationship with GDP, and how it is a useful new macro statistic that can be helpful in determining the direction of the economy, how important business is in the economy compared to consumption, how it can be helpful in not only the direction of the economy, but the issue of inflation, monetary policy. So this is an area that I have focused on for quite some time since writing my book, The Structure of Production, which I wrote in 1990 and was published by NYU Press. So what I've actually tried to do is basically develop a macro model that kind of completes macroeconomics as a puzzle. In other words, it's a large piece of the puzzle that has been missing from macroeconomics for some time, with the focus on GDP and aggregate demand and so forth. It has not sufficiently measured aggregate supply, if you will. So gross output is a statistic that has recently been developed and actually been accepted by the US government and in actually OECD countries. The OECD does monitor on an annual basis gross output. So to understand what gross output is, let's start with our first slide. And this is a picture of what's missing from GDP. And of course, there's a lot of things missing from GDP, but we'll just use the normal equation. GDP is C plus I plus G. We're ignoring net exports at this point. In the US, it was $24.15 trillion. Is this the entire economy? And the fact is that it is not. It measures final output only, and a lot of times we don't emphasize that enough in our teaching of economics or even in the media. And that leads to a lot of mischief in the misuse of GDP statistics. So what's missing from GDP? If you'll click on the next picture here, there you are. C plus I plus G gives the amounts of each one. And you can see here what's missing is the supply chain. And the supply chain has come into quite a bit of interest lately because of the shortages that have occurred during the lockdown and the pandemic caused remarkable shortages in the supply chain. So this is why the supply chain is really important. It's often ignored because the emphasis has always been on final output rather than the supply chain. And notice that the supply chain is substantially larger than GDP itself. It's over $32 trillion in terms of businesses, B2B spending in the intermediate stages of production on its way to final output. GDP in the US is $23 trillion. Supply chain is $32 trillion, substantially more, and suggests that business is a far more important factor in the economy and actual spending in the economy than you see in when you just use GDP statistics. So this is the book that I published in 1990, Structure of Production, and in it I developed a four-stage model of the economies. The four-stage model of the economy, as you can see here, is a very simple model, but a very powerful model. It kind of simplifies what GO and GDP are all about. So you have four stages of production. This applies to all goods and services. All goods and services go through this production process. So you'll see that each stage adds value as each stage goes along until you come to stage number 4, and that's final output of GDP. These are all finished goods and services representing GDP. So let us not ignore the spending patterns in the stages of production in number 1, 2, and 3. And that's what GO does. GO actually measures 1, 2, 3, and 4 all together. So gross output is a more complete measure of the economy. It measures all stages of production, all 4 stages, not just the 4th stage. So it's what I call the missing piece in macroeconomics, and it's a pretty substantial missing piece. It's bigger than the previous the macro GDP statistic before. I like to think of it, GO, in the relationship to GDP, similar in the financial markets, of which I play a role in as an editor of my investment newsletter since 1980. And that is the development of top line and bottom line. If you've ever taken accounting class, or if you've ever watched CNBC or other business networks, Bloomberg and so forth, everybody talks about the top line and the bottom line in the financial statements of the publicly traded firms. Every quarter they come out with their financial statement, their P&L statement. And you have the top line, which measures sales and revenue, but you also have the bottom line, which is earnings and net income. And I've developed a similar approach with GO and GDP. So the top line measures spending at all stages of production. And so that's the top line in national income accounting. And then the bottom line is GDP, which measures value added, or the final product, similar to what we might call gross profit in financial statements. So it's a little bit different than the net income statement. It's more like gross income. And but what you have here is basically the economics profession catching up with accounting and finance. And I know economics economists always consider themselves superior to accounting and finance, but I think in this case, accounting and finance can tell us something that we economists had not really thought of before. And the next slide, I show you a financial statement, which shows you the top line and bottom line, total revenues, and then net income at the bottom line, just to show you what a typical income statement does. And so this is really quite a revolution in economics to indicate that there are really 2 macro statistics top line and bottom line, gross output and GDP. And just as in Wall Street, no good analyst ignores and just looks at the bottom line. They also want to look at the top line. You got to look at revenues, you got to look at costs, you have to look at the bottom line, you have to look at both the top line and the bottom line. Same thing in economics. It's valuable to look at gross output and GDP. So GO does not replace GDP. They're complementary. So in my textbook, Economic Logic, and in other textbooks that are incorporating gross output, it's just adding it on as a top line, and then you continue to discuss the bottom line. And they both say different things. So the big breakthrough occurred in April of 2014. I had a Wall Street Journal article announcing that the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA, is now the government agency. BEA comes out with GDP on a regular basis. They're the ones who release the GDP statistics every quarter. Now, starting in April 2014, they are releasing GO as well, the top line and the bottom line. So I had a major Wall Street Journal article that was published worldwide. At last, a better economic measure, gross output, will correct the fallacy fostered by GDP that consumer spending drives the economy. I love the cartoon here. The cartoonist actually captured very nicely the 4 stages of production of gross output. So I was really pleased with that. So this was a real triumph for my structure of production. I had advocated in 1990 in my book, The Structure of Production, that GO should be added to the government statistics to measure total spending in the economy and not just final output. So this is what actually happened. And then we have this quote below from Steve Landefeld, who was instrumental in the BEA adopting gross output. And he states, gross output provides an important new perspective on the economy and a powerful new set of tools of analysis, one that is closer to the way many businesses see themselves. And that's actually right. As Sir John Hicks said, gross output is a statistic. And I met with him in the late 1980s when I was working on my book, The Structure of Production. And he was disappointed that economists were ignoring the supply chain, the value of the supply chain, the structure of production, the stages of production, and he called it a neoclassical model. And he said, this is similar to the way the merchant looks at things, the business perspective of buying supplies and adding value at each stage of production is the idea. Now, I say up here, this is a triumph in Austrian supply side economics, but it's really broader than that, because not only is gross output a measure of Hayek's triangles, for those who are familiar with Austrian macroeconomics, Hayek's triangles, which measures all stages of production, but it also is part of Irving Fisher's equation of exchange. It measures the T of price times T, the T transactions, which is transactions in the economy throughout. It's also Keynesian in the sense that it's a measure of aggregate demand, because it is a description, it is a measure of businesses writing checks at all stages of production. Well, when you write checks, you create demand. So it is a measure of aggregate demand. And what I like about GO is that it's being adopted and accepted by people across the political spectrum, from Austrians all the way to Keynesians. Maybe not the Marxists, who knows about them, but a standard neoclassical model. I believe in 10 years, all the textbooks will have a measure of top line and bottom line. I'm about halfway there in terms of acceptance by economists. And there is a lot of people raising questions about gross output. Feel free to ask any questions you'd like about this new statistic. So this is a picture of me with the members of the BEA at the time where this announcement was made. I've made a very big point of spending time with the BEA. There's always a lot of criticism that government officials are biased, prejudiced, and but I found that the BEA is a very professional group of economists who are trying to do the best they can. And actually, in many ways, this has restored my faith in government. They have advanced this concept while I'm still struggling to get. I've written a number of articles for the AER and other economic publications, and all of them are being rejected. So I'm in the early stages of what we call a paradigm shift. My books are being published on this subject. The Forbes magazine, Steve Forbes has endorsed it. The Wall Street Journal has endorsed it. But the economics profession is a little bit behind on actually the government agency that is collecting and publishing the data on gross output. So that's a little bit of background information and the kind of fight that I have had with the economics profession, including some Austrians at GMU who are having a hard time figuring out what this is all about. You have to have kind of a business perspective on this, as Sir John Hicks indicated. So this is an indication of how the BEA has redefined GDP as basically GDP plus the supply chain, II equals GO, or you could say GDP is equal to GO minus intermediate inputs. Okay, so we can see how the BEA itself is actually redefining GDP in terms of gross output. They are integrating gross output into their macro statistics. And this is a great quote from a Harvard professor, Dale Jorgensen, Stephen Landfeld, who is the director of the BEA in 2014, and Bill Nordhaus, the Nobel Prize-winning economist. Gross output, GO, is the natural measure of the production sector, while net output, GDP, is appropriate as a measure of welfare. Both are required in a complete systems of accounts. So if this is all new to you, it's because economists, the textbook writers, and the people writing papers and so forth have been slow in responding to other economists who have put forth information on GO. All right, so let's see, what can we learn from the new GO statistic? Well, number one is that we see that business spending is substantially larger and more important than consumer spending. Consumer spending is not the main driver of the economy, which is constantly being promoted by the financial media and some economists who should know better. Even Janet Yellen, I've had to scold Janet Yellen, and Robert Reich and a number of other economists who say that consumer spending is the biggest sector of the economy. It is not. As you can see here, the green line, business spending, is much larger than consumer spending. It's much more volatile because it includes the supply chain, which is far more volatile than final consumption. So you can see here that consumption doesn't really change a lot, but business spending does, and it's substantially larger. So here we see that what we have here are the ups and downs in the economy. And so what we demonstrate is that GDP, or gross output, is more volatile than GDP and does a better job of describing the business cycle. For example, back in 2008, we know how we came perilously close to a collapse. And by the way, despite the fact that the money supply increased 10%, Milton Friedman would have been surprised about that. But you can see in 2008 how the adjusted gross output dropped dramatically compared to GDP. So it's a much better indicator of what's happening in the business cycle, both in 2008 and in 2020. So here you can see changes in GDP. This shows it even better on how volatile gross output is compared to GDP during 2008 as well as 2020. So dramatic shifts in the two sectors of the economy. And again, gross output is much more volatile than GDP. So this is the latest statistics. Now, unfortunately, third quarter GDP is, well, we have third quarter GDP and third quarter gross output. Now, fourth quarter GDP just came out. There is a lag, unfortunately, between gross output and GDP releases by the BEA. But I just wanted to show you the difference in nominal and real income to show you how serious the inflation was in the deflators in GDP and GO. As you can see, nominal rates, you see double-digit growth in gross output. Adjusted gross output, it's a technical difference between GO and adjusted GO. I can explain that if anybody's interested in that. I talk about it in grossoutput.com, my website on this subject. I don't want to spend time on that right now because we're moving along here in time. But you can see that in nominal terms, we see double-digit gains in gross output and adjusted gross output. But in real terms, it is substantially less. Inflation definitely picked up. You can see that on the next chart here. You can also see on this that nominal GO, total spending in the economy is over $51 trillion in the US economy, 51 trillion. So the economy is not GDP, that's final spending only, that's 23 trillion. But if you really want to measure total spending in the economy, it's $51 trillion. That's how big it is. And it has been growing rather dramatically, as you can see here, growing faster than, well, this is just GO itself, but I did want to demonstrate how GO, the green line in nominal terms, is growing much faster than GO in real time. And it also raises the issue is how accurate are these deflators for GDP and GO? As long as, you know, there are probably some serious problems with it, but as long as they are consistently defective, maybe we can rely on them. But we can see that since the pandemic ended, nominal GO has been growing much faster than GO, which is an indication that inflation is definitely picking up. So you can see that there. So here's the GDP price index, or the deflator, and the gross output price deflator. They tend to move together on that. But again, you can see that the GO price index is, since the pandemic, since March of 2020, the supply chain shortage has caused inflation to be more rapid than the price deflator of GDP and the consumer price index. So this is showing the volatility of the supply chain price index, similar to the producer price index in the US. And you can see that the red line is much more volatile. And again, you can see it rising much faster because of the shortage situation with the supply chain. The producer price index, the intermediate inputs price index, is growing at a much faster rate than the consumer price index. And that fits in with the philosophy that the earlier stages of production are more volatile. And when the economy turns around, then you see a more dramatic increase in production as well as pricing, especially with the inflationary scenario that was been promoted by both the Trump and Biden administration. Okay, this is a general model of the economy. I'm going to pass by this, but you can basically see the make economy versus the use economy and the relationship between GO and GDP. What is my approach here with GO? One is we want to have a whole production process looked at. So we want to look at GO, not just GDP. We want to disaggregate the economy. We want to analyze not just the consumer price index, but the producer price index and the commodity price index. We want to look at stages of production and see what's happening in the economy. We want to look beyond the interest rate, but to look at short-term and long-term rates, the yield curve. More and more analysts are doing that. We want to look more beyond the rate of unemployment, but the structure of employment and unemployment. Go beyond the broad stock indexes. So this has application in the financial markets. I've done some work on energy stocks, for example, where you have downstream, midstream, and upstream a way of looking at it. And it's interesting how stocks further moved away from final use are much more volatile. So we want to look. Basically the structure of the economy does matter. We don't want to be too aggregate. we want to disaggregate as much as we can. So there are some textbooks. This is my own textbook, Economic Logic, in its 5th edition, that fully integrates GO and GDP. And then these are some of the other textbooks that are being used in the United States that do have a mention of gross output, but have not fully integrated it like my own textbook. So these are some of my conclusions. One of the things that's important is number 4, phase supports supply side economics is showing that business spending is substantially larger than consumer spending. So our indicators, if you look at the leading indicators in the US, it tends to be more business oriented, and that is more consistent. I believe the GO model is now aligns economic growth with macro statistics. GDP, arguing consumers drive the economy, 70% of GDP, goes contrary to economic growth theory. And it confirms Say's law. Say's law is gaining a lot of interest in today's economy. Supply is more important than demand, production more important than consumption. Provides a link between micro and macro, and it does a better job than GDP in measuring and anticipate the up and downs of the business cycle. And I should also mention that several private economists are using GO to predict the next GDP move. And whenever GO is greater than is growing faster than GDP, that's optimistic. And it did a perfect job just this last quarter when GDP just came out for the first quarter, which surprised economists because it grew faster. And my GO model did predict that because GO is growing faster than GDP. Well, these are quotes from others saying we'll pass on that, but go to the last slide if people want more information about gross output and anything that we've talked about here. If we could go to the last slide, I think that gives my contact information. Keep going. The final slide. One more. Yeah, there we go. So we can just, that's the final slide. So you can contact me at mskousen@chapman.edu, a couple of my websites, and then particularly regarding gross output, I do have a website called grossoutput.com, which I've had for several years. And I do a press release every quarter. Whenever BEA comes out with the gross output data, I analyze it, write about it, and issue a press release. You can go to grossoutput.com for that. So that's everything I have, Juan.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your very good presentation, really interesting, and also for being so kind to address the questions from our audience. And we will very much look into your recent publications and the latest that I just mentioned in my introduction of the talk. And we look forward to having you again with us in our forthcoming events.
Great, Juan. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you very much again. And to all of you following this from home, thank you very much for your contributions, for sending us your questions. There will be 2 more webinars in the winter term. You'll have more information about them on our website. Thank you very much.